Environmental campaigners tore up rapeseed plants during yesterday's demonstration at a government testing site near Watlington. Thames Valley Police say they expect to make more arrests after studying video footage of the protest. The 6 have been released on bail.
The field was one of 6 special trial sites being monitored by the government for research into GM crops.
It started as a peaceful protest. Demonstrators surrounded the field of GM oilseed rape, one of only 6 large-scale government-sponsored experiments studying how GM crops affect the environment. But a small group broke onto the site and destroyed at least 2/3 of the crop, effectively scuppering the entire trial. The police made 3 arrests and plan to track down others involved and charge them with criminal damage. The GM industry condemned the action and said the government must uphold the law and allow legal and scientifically based trials like these to continue. The industry said the government must decide whether they or anti-GM pressure groups are running the country. Margaret Gilmore, BBC News.
But first tonight, he's more used to the inside of the House of Lords than a prison cell. But this evening, the boss of Greenpeace is in custody after being arrested in Norfolk. Lord Peter MELCHETT was detained after environmental campaigners destroyed a field of genetically modified maize. But now scientists are warning in the future such experiments may have to be conducted in secret. Some of the pictures in Catherine Jones's report were filmed by Greenpeace.
5:15 a.m. Greenpeace launches a dawn raid to destroy a farm-scale trial of genetically modified maize. And not just by hand. This footage, shot by Greenpeace, shows the agricultural mower they managed to get into the field to flatten it. Among the protesters, the pressure group's executive director, Lord Peter MELCHETT.
Genetic contamination, and it's unacceptable for people of this country, and it shouldn't be being grown.
But to the farmer, this was vandalism, pure and simple. Caught on camera by a journalist at the scene, this JCB attempted to ram the Greenpeace truck.
Despite what your personal feelings may be, it happens to be private property.
Once the police arrived, 30 people, including Lord MELCHETT, were arrested. By the end of the protest, around half of the 6-acre field had been flattened.
I think this is about anarchy as opposed to democratic government. I'm a farmer who offered land for those trials, and here we got people who believe that they shouldn't be carried out, instead of going through democratic means, taking the law into their own hands.
Greenpeace says it's breaking the law on behalf of the British people, but it's a tactic that could backfire. Tonight the government's roundly condemned the protest, and the biotech company which planted this maize says after having 2 of its sites vandalised in the last 2 weeks, its only option now is to ask ministers to sanction secret trials. Catherine Jones, 5 News.
As you said, this is the 3rd field damaged out of only 7 large-scale GM experiments in the entire UK. The aim is to see if these genetically modified crops damage crops and wildlife in other fields nearby. But Greenpeace is determined to stop the entire GM experiment. As part of their stunt, Greenpeace filmed themselves destroying the crop. Their leader, Peter MELCHETT, and 30 others tore up what they could using tractors and strimmers before being arrested.
Please stop, you're being asked.
They now face charges of causing criminal damage. They argue the GM experiment will contaminate the surrounding countryside.
Whether through the seeds or the pollen, it can contaminate other crops, organic crops, which will then become genetically engineered in themselves. It may affect wildlife, we don't know, in all sorts of unpredictable ways. And once that's released out into the environment, affecting the environment, you can't bring it back.
But government scientists surveying the scene tonight insist this was a carefully controlled experiment that wouldn't pollute, but would show whether GM crops could be safely grown in future. The farmer who planted the GM maize had woken at 5 this morning to find the protesters had changed the lock into his field and he couldn't get in to stop them destroying it.
Well, I'm absolutely devastated. I mean, here's a trial that was being sponsored by government with a large amount of government money going into it, and this has all been destroyed because somebody has made up their mind that they want anarchy rather than democratic government.
6 weeks ago in Wiltshire, the first large-scale GM trial was killed off with pesticide when the farmer pulled out. A second crop was destroyed in Oxfordshire 8 days ago by anti-GM activists. The company behind the experiment says the future of the 4 remaining trials is now in doubt.
There's obviously a big question mark over, what's going to happen to the others. We would hope that common sense will prevail and those trials will be allowed to go to fruition, but we're going to need the support of government to protect these sites now, I believe.
Well, we've had the police down here, we've had the scientists, and we've had the GM company involved. And tonight they've called for an urgent meeting with the government to discuss security at the remaining GM crop sites.
Behind it, Greenpeace activists. 30 of them were arrested, including their executive director, Lord MELCHETT. The company behind the trials has demanded more protection, warning that the last remaining trial crops in the country could now be at risk. The raid happened early this morning when the protesters used a large mower to cut down part of a 6-acre field of maize near Ling, near Norwich. The incident was filmed by someone alerted by Greenpeace. The crop was planted in May by the agrochemical company Agro-Evo and was due to flower next week. In spite of the bitter complaints, the police initially tried to defuse the situation.
No. Yeah, well, come on.
No,
Look,
stop.
Inspector, I'd rather carry on if we're not under arrest. Well, arrest the police. He's on my property. He's on my property. Now arrest him.
Lord MELCHETT himself was forthright in his views over the action Greenpeace was taking.
Well, I don't think anyone should be arrested for doing this. We're doing something which the public wants and which is for the benefit of the environment.
So are the environmentalists fighting legitimate scientific progress? Sarah BURTON, who's campaigns director of Greenpeace, is with me now. What efforts had you made to get either the farmer, the government or the law to intercede to prevent this being planted or harvested?
Well, we have taken very strenuous efforts. In fact, we've been writing to the company asking them to stop the field trials before they flowered, before genetic pollution was inevitable from the crops. We have written to the Attorney General asking him to prosecute for public nuisance over these crops, which are going to contaminate other crops, non-GM crops, and possibly organic crops.
But this was, in the end, a perfectly legal activity, legitimate activity, sanctioned by government, supported by people that were elected to do that.
And it's being done without the consent of the public. Our own polls, government polls, poll after poll for supermarkets, food producers say the public don't want to eat it. They don't want it mixed up with their food. The food producers won't have it. The supermarkets don't want it.
Yeah, but I mean, this is pure Luddite stuff, isn't it? I mean, the fact of the matter is, somewhere, sometime, somebody's going to have to test these things to see if they are dangerous to health.
You don't need to test them in a way that means that the pollution is inevitable. In other words, you don't need to test them in a laboratory. They're being grown in the United States. We see studies from there. We can see there are dangers. We also know there are some risks you cannot test for. This is about as scientific a program.
What right do you have to go into somebody's field for a legitimately planted crop, legally planted, legally sanctioned, and rip it up? It is an act of vandalism.
This is about as legitimate a scientific program as Japanese whaling is, and it's been described that way to me by an independent scientist. Now, in response to your question, the activists today were decontaminating a field. The farmer,
but illegally.
Well, that's a matter of opinion.
It's not a matter of opinion. You went into somebody else's property and tore up his crop, which had been legally sanctioned by the government.
It's a matter of opinion whether anyone behaved illegally. Nobody's been convicted of an offense over this, and I'm not going to comment on the legal status when people are still being held by the police. But I will say that it was a legitimate action on behalf of the public, carried out by people who...
How can you say it was on behalf of the public? Have you consulted the public? You weren't elected to Parliament on this. I mean, why don't you run, to actually pursue these thoughts?
Well, Greenpeace has consulted the public by doing its own polling through MORI, and the public have told us 79%, that's a huge majority, that they don't want these field trials.
Thank you very much for coming in, Sarah BURTON.
Today, this Norwich expert and 83 others said the trials are needed to see if GM crops can safely be grown here in future.
Farmers around the world lose 40% of their yield to diseases and pests. Now, we can combat that, but we can only combat it today by spraying on chemicals and pesticides. The genetic solution, and this is what the scientists are working on, is to design genes which will give a genetic resistance.
That now means 3 of the 7 government farm-scale trials have been disrupted, affecting the long-term research. We don't yet know if GM foods are something that will improve our society, but at this rate, will we ever? In a moment, our science correspondent Susan Watts reports. But here in the studio, I have with us John SAUVEN of Greenpeace and Michael Meacher, the Environment Minister. John SAUVEN, what gives you the right to destroy someone else's property?
Well, I think, first of all, you said local farmers in your introduction. We held a public meeting in the village next to where this GM crop trial was taking place 2 weeks ago, and we were expecting 3 or 4 people to turn up. And in effect, there were 100 or 200 people turned up. Every single person was opposed to the GM crop trial. Every single farmer was up in arms that this GM crop trial was taking place in their locality.
Surely you went on somebody else's property, destroyed somebody else's property.
There had been absolutely no public consultation whatsoever. And as you saw last weekend in Watlington, you saw again hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people pulling up a GM crop trial. That was local beekeepers,
but that doesn't make what you
farmers,
did right. Surely there are ways to protest.
There are ways to protest, and this is quite a legitimate way to protest when the government is not listening to what people are saying. Opinion poll after opinion poll, and the latest one taken just a week ago showed 79% of the population were against GM crop trials. And the government's own polls show exactly the same thing. In fact, they did a poll that showed only 1% of the people supported GM food.
I'm going to return to the surveys in a moment because you can select surveys to suit your purposes. Michael Meacher, the government is not listening. If you had actually handled this problem properly, they wouldn't be resorting to such methods.
Well, that is nonsense. The government is listening. I would understand it if this was a totalitarian government, there was no freedom of speech, the government wasn't listening. That is nonsense. We are a democratic government, there is freedom of speech, and we are listening. The evidence for that is that we have set up our own farm-scale evaluation programme precisely to find out what are the effects of GM crops on the environment. We are going to publish that information, we're going to be open and transparent, and it will be the public ultimately who take a decision about whether or not this is acceptable. We do not need violence, and that is not the way to make a decision.
One second, John SAUVEN.
We're a peaceful organisation. We have never, ever used violence in our whole 25-year history.
We shall return to this discussion, but we can now look at this particular story, today's story, in a bit more detail. Susan Watts reports.
Today's was the most serious attack to date on the government's trials on genetically modified crops. This one had a new tone. It was a high-profile Greenpeace event with 30 arrests, including their leader, Lord MELCHETT. It did not please English Nature.
English Nature very much regrets that these crops were destroyed this morning. The field-scale trials are very important to establish whether genetically modified crops have an adverse impact on the environment or not. We needed the results that this crop could offer, and we're not now going to get them, and I think that's very regrettable.
There were 7 farm-scale trials, and they were all on the protesters' hit list. 3 have already been damaged. The first after a series of protests earlier this year against an oilseed rape crop in Wiltshire. In early June, the farmer playing host to the trial sprayed the crop himself with herbicide, after family trustees grew increasingly anxious. The second attack came last weekend at Watlington in Oxfordshire. Peaceful protesters scythed their way through the field of oilseed rape, but the mood turned ugly towards the end of the day and there were several arrests. Then today's direct action in Norwich took tension over the trials to a new pitch. This left only 4 trial sites up and running. This may well be the next target on the protesters' hit list. Here at Little Park Farm near Reading, they're growing GM maize for animal feed. The police were down here today advising the farmer on security. But at the same time, the government was conceding it's almost impossible to keep people out, and that the only way to protect these trials may be to move them to secret locations. The farmer wasn't keen to talk to us today, but Pat Froome stopped long enough to tell us he took part in the trials because he fears Britain will fall behind the rest of Europe in technology.
Left behind in the second division again.
And how do you feel about the fact that 3 of the sites have now been destroyed in this way, or partially destroyed? But the farmer knows that the protest group which destroyed the GM crop today is now turning its attention to his quiet corner of Berkshire. I talked to Doug Parr of Greenpeace at the farm gates. The farmer here is obviously very unhappy about your protest. Why are you disrupting the democratic process in this way?
let's remember that democracy is about governments doing what the people want or doing what people ask for. We believe there's no mandate from the British public for doing genetically modified crop trials on this scale, on this kind of nature. And so we're taking action on behalf of the public because the government isn't listening.
Parliamentary
But some Labour
who put out the
backbenchers
press
have been
releases. It is the defining issue of our time.
A week ago, MP Alan Simpson was warming up the crowd at the Watlington crop protest. Tonight, he called on the government not to opt for secrecy.
It would be very dangerous for the government to go down a path of non-disclosure. First of all, the public would conclude that there was something deeply furtive and suspicious about the trials themselves, and there may well be. Second, you would have equal concerns within farming communities about the risks that they were being exposed to. And this is particularly important in respect of organic farmers whose very livelihoods depend on non-pollution from GM crops. And finally, I think that it would escalate the level of social protest.
If the protests convince the government to go for secret trials, it's hard to see how this can please anyone, protesters, scientists, or a public rapidly losing its trust in any of the voices in the GM debate.
Michael Meacher, is the solution secret trials?
No, I hope it isn't. I would much prefer there to be continued transparency. We are required under the European directive to provide site locations where experiments are taking place. And of course we respect that. That's exactly what we have done.
But the Cabinet Office did release a statement suggesting that they may have to go to secret trials today.
I do think that if this level of violence does continue, level of illegal activity, violence against property, which is not people's own property, then I think we may have to look at different options. I would much rather we didn't do that, but I think this is unacceptable. These are trials which need to go ahead for the nation's knowledge.
John SAUVEN, it is a problem that your protesting may have backfired in that they'll become secret, the trials.
Well, these trials are completely illegitimate and they should be stopped. I mean, what you see here is creeping commercialization of GM crops into this country. It's exactly the same when the Japanese go whaling in Antarctica, they call it scientific whaling. All they're doing is keeping open a commercial market for whale meat. What you see here is chemical companies doing exactly the same thing. They're starting GM crop trials, they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
So you
and
will
all
continue
you're just going to have
protesting?
a fait accompli. Look, the public, you have to ask Michael Meacher this question.
No,
this is
one second.
taxpayers'
No, I want to
money.
ask you one
Yes,
question. Will Greenpeace continue to destroy other people's property?
Look, there are three GM crop trials that have been destroyed. The first one was destroyed by the owners of a farm because they were opposed to the farmer doing the crop trial. The second one was destroyed by hundreds of ordinary people, beekeepers, gardeners, parents, old people, young people. The third one was uprooted by Greenpeace. The fourth one, I don't know who's going to uproot the fourth one.
Perhaps you want this to go to a jury trial in the hope that it would be acquitted and you'll get the publicity from that.
It's got absolutely nothing to do with publicity. It's got everything to do with the fact that public opinion overwhelmingly in this country is against GM food. Why is Michael Meacher's government wasting taxpayers' money on something for which there is no market, nobody wants to buy it, the supermarkets don't want to sell it, the food producers don't want to produce it, so why are you squandering millions of pounds of taxpayers' money on this? Why don't you instead invest the money in organic?
I think the most important point I need to make is this is not creeping commercialisation. I have made it absolutely clear that there
why are you doing it?
Can I just make this very important statement? There will be no widespread cultivation of GM crops in this country until we have established on authoritative evidence, which we have made open to the public, that there is no risk to biodiversity or the environment. That's the first important point. Secondly, I do believe that we need to have an answer to the question of whether this damages the environment. There may be some fundamentalists who don't want to have anything to do with GM crops under any circumstances whatsoever. I don't believe that that is the view of the British public. We have heard from John that there's been public opinion research surveys which are against GM foods. In The Guardian and Independent, I read in this last week, 69% of population believe these trials should continue.
So
I
will
think
you
that's
offer
right.
protection so the trials will continue? Will you offer police protection of these farms?
Well, we certainly believe that if we can, but we cannot police every field. What I can say to those who are doing this is the government is listening. The fact is we are negotiating with industry for an extension on the agreement that we've got with industry this year that there will be no widespread cultivation until we have clear answers. We intend to do that for several years in future.
Michael, you are Minister for the Environment, not Minister for the chemical industry. At the moment, you are standing up for the chemical industry against the wishes of public opinion, against the wishes of the supermarket, against the wishes of the food producers.
You have no idea.
We have done an opinion poll that showed 79% of the public were against GM field trials. Now, this was released today.
Will you? What will stop you doing this again?
What will stop you doing this again? Shows that public opinion are opposed to what the government is doing.
The surveys aren't going to do any good because you can pick whichever one you want to suit your purposes. But just tell us, are you going to continue doing this?
Look, people...
You still haven't answered the question. Should we take it as a yes, that you will continue destroying
People will continue opposing GM field trials, yes. And people every day are showing their opposition to GM food in terms of what they buy in the supermarket.
John SAUVEN, Michael Meacher, thank you both very much. We shall leave it there.
The test site near Harpenden is the biggest in the country, and protesters say they haven't ruled it out as a possible target. Scientists say it's a crucial part of their research. In a moment, I'll be speaking to Environment Minister Michael Meacher, but first, Yvonne Hall takes up the story.
2.5 acres of genetically modified corn are being grown in this field in the village of Redbourne near Harpenden. Scientists fear it could be the next target for protesters. They're stepping up security, but admit it's impossible to make an open field totally secure. This corn has been modified with herbicide-resistant genes to help boost the yield. Scientists say it's crucial research, and they're condemning the crop saboteurs.
Well, we're extremely disappointed that protesters have stopped some very valuable research. Research that the British government will need on either side of the argument. If we're going to compete, as it were, with the United States, if we're going to ban GM, we'll need to know why we're going to ban it.
But many people living just a few yards from the field were shocked to hear for the first time today what's growing there.
I'm really surprised that you've told me it's genetically modified crops. Unless it's been in the local paper, which I don't think it has, I don't think many people around here would be aware of it.
Well, I'm a little bit concerned, but mostly for people who might be growing their own crops in their gardens, for, you know, the way it's pollinated.
The concerns in Hertfordshire follow 2 recent attacks on GM crops, the first in Oxfordshire last week and the second in Norfolk yesterday. Earlier this year, there were protests when scientists in America found out that GM maize killed off the monarch butterfly. Protesters say such crops are contaminating the environment and are legitimate targets.
We never discuss, our action plans in advance. I think it is quite legitimate for people, for the public, to stop pollution and contamination of the environment taking place from GM crops.
As security has stepped up near the GM crops in Redbourne, campaigners claim people from all walks of life are joining the protest, and they're accusing the government, who are funding the trials, of ignoring public opinion. Yvonne Hall, Newsroom South East, Redbourne in Hertfordshire.
Greenpeace UK is spending the night in a cell after being remanded in custody in Norwich. He was arrested during a Greenpeace demonstration in a field of genetically modified maize in Norfolk yesterday.
Lord Peter Melchett was supposed to be travelling to Tanzania for a 2.5-week family holiday tomorrow, but having been remanded in custody at Norwich Magistrates Court this morning, he'll probably be stopping here for a while. Lord Melchett, seen here yesterday, was one of 28 Greenpeace activists arrested in a field of genetically modified maize in Norfolk.
Well, I don't think anyone should be arrested for doing this. We're doing something which the public wants and which is for the benefit of the environment.
He's now been charged with theft and criminal damage. The 27 others also appeared in court today on similar charges, although they were all granted bail. Lord Melchett's forebears perhaps make him an unlikely environmental campaigner. His great-grandfather was the first chairman of ICI. He himself was once a more conventional political figure, a junior minister for Jim Callaghan in Northern Ireland during the 70s. but he turned his back on party politics to get involved in direct action, supporting, amongst other things, a Ramblers campaign against pesticides.
Footpaths should be kept clear of crops anyhow. So, in theory, there shouldn't be any adverse consequences for farmers. And in any event, many people are advising farmers to use less sprays, to try and leave the edges of fields unsprayed to benefit wildlife.
Despite the disruption to their holiday, Lord Melchett's family have issued a statement supporting his beliefs and his actions. The magistrate has adjourned the hearing until next Thursday.
Asked more than 1,000 suppliers to replace GM ingredients with other alternatives. Sainsbury's is not the first chain to respond to consumer concern. Iceland and Marks & Spencer's say their own branded foods are already GM-free. But the larger supermarkets, Tesco, Asda and Safeway, say it'll be later in the year before they've removed all GM derivatives from their own brands. Our Consumer Affairs reporter Karen Bauman has been to a Sainsbury's store in central London.
Sainsbury's has been working on identifying and eliminating GM ingredients from its own brand products for the past 3 years. Now, after liaising with more than 1,000 suppliers, the company says it's succeeded.
The news Sainsbury's own label foods no longer contain genetically modified soya protein, tomato puree or maize is likely to please the store's 9 million customers. But even this reassurance comes with a caution.
Of course, there might be a few traces, but you must never say never. We've worked with our suppliers to achieve our goal of elimination of GM ingredients, and that we've done today.
The problem is that even so-called GM-free products can contain traces of GM ingredients because of cross-contamination of crops or accidents. The amount such foods contain and what retailers believe consumers will reasonably accept is known as the tolerance level. At the moment, manufacturers are waiting for the EU to set a legal limit.
I think the important thing is to develop a common industry standard so that we can be sure that when retailers and manufacturers are making claims about removing GM ingredients, that they all mean the same thing, and so we can compare products when they're actually on the shelves. And what that involves is putting controls in place all the way through the food chain.
It's this traceability of GM products that particularly concerns UK retailers and food manufacturers. The major supermarkets are now confident they will have eradicated GM ingredients from their own products by the end of the year.
Today's move is further proof of the extent to which supermarkets are now prepared to listen to the concerns of the consumer. But while the move may be towards more traditional farming and food processing methods, it's almost impossible to guarantee that any foods are completely GM-free. Anna.